The Thompson family had always dreamed of a peaceful life in the suburbs. After years of living in a busy city, they finally decided it was time for a change. They wanted a place where their kids could ride bikes on quiet streets, where weekends were spent gardening or hosting barbecues with neighbors, and where life felt slower, simpler, and more connected. That's how they ended up in Maplewood Estates, a gated community known for its manicured lawns, sparkling ponds, and friendly faces. When they first moved in 6 months ago, everything seemed perfect. The house was cozy but spacious. The backyard big enough for weekend football games, and there was even an old barn that came with the property. It wasn't much to look at, just a weathered wooden structure with rusted hinges, but it had potential. The Thompsons figured they'd clean it up eventually and use it as a storage space for holiday decorations, tools, and maybe some old furniture. For now, though, it stayed locked. Mark, the dad, was your typical hard-working guy who loved tinkering with cars and grilling steaks on Sunday afternoons. His wife, Linda, was the backbone of the family, smart, strong-willed, and always ready with a quick laugh. She balanced being a hands-on mom with her career, which she rarely talked about outside of work circles. To most people in Maplewood, Linda was just another suburban mom who occasionally brought homemade cookies to block parties. What no one knew was that Linda wasn't just any mom. She was the police chief of her city, a position she'd earned after 2 decades of dedication and grit. But here in Maplewood, she preferred to keep that part of her life private. She liked blending in, enjoying the anonymity that came with small-town living. At first, things went smoothly. The neighbors were welcoming, the kids made friends at school, and the HOA, the Homeowners Association, seemed harmless enough. Sure, they sent out newsletters reminding everyone to trim their hedges and park their cars in designated spots, but it all felt like standard stuff. Nothing too over the top. At least, that's what Mark and Linda thought until they met Carol. Carol was, well, let's just say she took her role as the unofficial leader of the HOA very seriously. She wasn't officially elected or anything, but she acted like she ran the entire neighborhood. Every day you could see her walking around with a clipboard, jotting down notes about stray weeds, poking through cracks in driveways or flower pots that didn't match the community aesthetic. She had an eagle eye for details and zero tolerance for rule breakers. If someone left a trash can out overnight, Carol would leave a passive-aggressive note taped to their door by morning. If a kid's basketball hoop sat too close to the sidewalk, Carol would email the parents demanding immediate action. Some people found her annoying. Others thought she was downright ridiculous. But everyone agreed on one thing: Carol was impossible to ignore. For the most part, the Thompsons managed to stay off Carol's radar. They kept their lawn tidy, parked their cars in the right places, and generally followed the rules. But then came the barn. It started innocently enough. One sunny afternoon, Carol wandered past the Thompsons' property during one of her routine inspections, a phrase she used to justify her constant snooping. Her eyes landed on the barn, its doors firmly shut and padlocked. Something about it bothered her. Why was it always closed? What were they hiding inside? Carol's imagination went into overdrive. Maybe they were storing stolen goods. Or worse, running some kind of illegal operation. Whatever it was, she was determined to get to the bottom of it. A few days later, Carol marched up to the Thompsons' front door, clipboard in hand and a scowl on her face. Linda answered, still wearing an apron dusted with flour from baking banana bread. Before she could even say hello, Carol launched into her spiel. "I've been observing your barn," Carol declared, crossing her arms like she was interrogating a suspect. "Why is it always locked? Are you hiding something?" Linda blinked, caught off guard by the question. Was this woman serious? "It's locked because it has our personal belongings," she replied calmly. "We don't want anyone breaking in." Carol scoffed. "That's not how things work here. This is a community," she emphasized, dragging out the word like it carried some deep philosophical meaning. "If you're using that barn for anything questionable, I need to know right now." Linda bit back a laugh. Questionable? Seriously? All they had in there were boxes of Christmas lights and a rusty rake. But instead of rolling her eyes, she kept her cool. "Trust me, there's nothing questionable going on," she said firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse me," but Carol wasn't done. She stood there glaring, refusing to budge. Finally, when it became clear Linda wasn't going to offer any more information, Carol turned on her heel and stormed off, muttering under her breath about uncooperative residents. Little did Linda know this was only the beginning. Carol wasn't the type to give up easily. In fact, she was already cooking up a plan to expose whatever secrets she believed were hidden behind those barn doors. And soon, the Thompsons would find themselves smack in the middle of a situation far stranger and funnier than they ever could have imagined. Carol wasn't the kind of person to let things go. Once she set her mind on something, she chased it down with the intensity of a dog after a bone. So when Linda politely dismissed her accusations about the barn, Carol didn't just shrug and walk away. Oh no, that would have been too easy. Instead, she doubled down, convinced that there was more to the story than met the eye. Over the next few days, Carol made it her personal mission to uncover the truth about the Thompsons' barn. She started by casually asking other neighbors if they'd noticed anything unusual. Had they seen strange cars coming or going at odd hours? Heard any loud noises late at night? Most people shrugged her off, either because they hadn't noticed anything or because they didn't want to get involved in Carol's drama. But Carol wasn't discouraged. If anything, their lack of interest only fueled her determination. She began taking notes, lots of them. Every time she passed the Thompsons' house, she slowed down to inspect the barn from every angle. She even pulled out her phone once or twice to snap photos as though documenting evidence for some imaginary court case. One neighbor joked that she looked like a detective from one of those crime shows, but Carol didn't find it funny. To her, this wasn't a joke. This was serious business. Her suspicions grew stronger when she noticed that the barn doors were always locked. Not just closed, but padlocked tight. Why would anyone lock up an old barn unless they had something to hide? Carol's mind raced with possibilities. Maybe the Thompsons were running a secret workshop where they manufactured counterfeit goods. Or perhaps they were storing stolen items, expensive electronics, stacks of cash, who knows what else. The more she thought about it, the crazier her theories became. Eventually, Carol decided she needed backup. Reporting suspicious activity to the authorities was the logical next step, or so she told herself. After all, she was doing this for the good of the community, right? Protecting her neighbors from potential danger. That's how she justified dialing the non-emergency number for the local police department. One Saturday morning. When the dispatcher answered, Carol launched into her rehearsed spiel. "Hi, I'm calling to report suspicious activity at 12 Maplewood Lane," she said, enunciating each word carefully. "The residents there have a barn on their property, and it's always locked. I think they might be hiding something illegal inside." The dispatcher sounded skeptical. "Illegal, you say? Do you have any proof?" "Well, no," Carol admitted reluctantly. "But isn't it suspicious that they won't open it? And nobody seems to know what's inside. Doesn't that strike you as odd?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Ma'am, we typically respond to reports involving actual evidence of criminal activity. A locked barn doesn't necessarily qualify as suspicious behavior." "Is there anything else you can tell us?" Carol hesitated. She knew she didn't have concrete proof, but she couldn't back down now. "Just send someone over to check it out," she insisted. "You'll see what I mean." Reluctantly, the dispatcher agreed to send a patrol car to investigate. Carol hung up feeling triumphant. Justice would prevail, she thought. The truth would come out, and the Thompsons would finally have to explain themselves. Meanwhile, the Thompsons had no idea what was coming their way. Life was humming along as usual. Mark spent his days working at the office and tinkering with his car in the evenings. Linda juggled her responsibilities as a mom and a police chief. Though she kept her professional life separate from her suburban routine, their kids played outside with the neighborhood kids, laughing and chasing each other around the cul-de-sac. Everything seemed normal until Monday afternoon rolled around. Mark was the first to notice something was off. As he pulled into the driveway after work, he spotted 2 police cruisers parked near the curb. His heart skipped a beat. What on earth was going on? He hurried inside, expecting the worst. Had someone broken in? Was there an accident? Inside, he found Linda sitting calmly at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea while 2 uniformed officers stood awkwardly nearby. One of them looked particularly uncomfortable, shifting nervously from foot to foot. The scene was surreal. What's going on? Mark blurted out, panic creeping into his voice. Before anyone could answer, Linda spoke up. Her tone was calm, almost amused. Apparently, someone reported us for suspicious activity involving our barn. These officers are here to investigate. Mark blinked, processing her words. Suspicious activity? Their barn? It took a moment for the absurdity of the situation to sink in. Then, suddenly, it hit him like a ton of bricks. Wait, are you serious? He asked, looking between Linda and the officers. Our barn? Really? The lead officer cleared his throat. Yes, sir. We received a report claiming there might be illegal activity occurring on your property, specifically related to the barn. Mark turned to Linda, completely baffled. Did you know about this? Linda shook her head, but there was a glimmer of amusement in her eyes. Not until these gentlemen showed up. The officer shifted, uncomfortably again, clearly sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Finally, he glanced at Linda and said, Ma'am, do you mind telling us what's inside the barn? Linda raised an eyebrow, suppressing a smirk. Boxes of Christmas lights, some old gardening tools, and maybe a rake or 2. Definitely nothing illegal. The officer nodded slowly, still unsure whether to believe her. Then, almost as an afterthought, he asked, And why is it locked? To keep people out, Linda replied matter-of-factly. We don't want strangers poking around our stuff. Isn't that why most people lock their sheds or garages? The officer couldn't argue with that logic. Still, protocol required him to verify her claim. Would you mind unlocking it so we can take a quick look? Linda sighed dramatically but obliged. She grabbed the key from a hook near the door and led everyone outside. As she unlocked the barn and swung the creaky doors open, the officers peered inside. Sure enough, it was exactly as Linda had described. Dusty boxes stacked neatly against the walls, a few rusty tools leaning in the corner, and not a single sign of anything remotely suspicious. Well, the officer said, scratching the back of his neck, this looks normal. Linda crossed her arms and gave him a pointed look. Glad we could clear that up. As the officers prepared to leave, Mark couldn't resist chiming in. So, who called us in anyway? Just curious. The officer hesitated, then admitted, a member of your homeowners association, someone named Carol. That name sent a jolt of recognition through both Mark and Linda. They exchanged a knowing glance before Linda turned back to the officer. Let me guess she's the one obsessed with rules and clipboards? The officer chuckled nervously. Sounds about right. Once the patrol cars drove off, Mark burst out laughing. Are you kidding me? All this fuss over a locked barn? What's next? Carol reporting us for having mismatched curtains. Linda joined in the laughter, though her amusement was mixed with irritation. Honestly, I should have seen this coming. That woman has been sniffing around since day one. Still, something about the situation gnawed at her. Carol had gone out of her way to accuse them of wrongdoing without any real evidence. Worse, she'd wasted valuable police resources on a wild goose chase. Linda knew better than anyone how stretched thin law enforcement already was. This kind of nonsense wasn't just annoying. It was irresponsible. As Mark and Linda stood there shaking their heads, they realized this wasn't the end of the story. Far from it. Carol had thrown down the gauntlet, and now it was time for the Thompsons to figure out how to handle her antics without letting things spiral out of control. One thing was certain, life in Maplewood Estates was about to get a whole lot more interesting. After the police left, Mark and Linda couldn't stop talking about what had just happened. It was like something out of a sitcom: a locked barn, nosy neighbors, and cops showing up at their doorstep over nothing. They laughed about it for a while, but as the initial shock wore off, reality started to sink in. This wasn't just funny anymore. It was personal. Linda, in particular, felt a mix of frustration and disbelief. She'd always prided herself on keeping her professional life separate from her home life. Being the police chief came with its own set of challenges: long hours, high-pressure decisions, and constant scrutiny, but here in Maplewood Estates, she liked being just another mom. Now, thanks to Carol's antics, her carefully guarded secret was out, or at least it would be soon enough. Once word got around that the police chief lived in the neighborhood, there'd be no going back to anonymity. And while Linda didn't mind people knowing who she was, she resented the idea that Carol's baseless accusations had forced her hand. That night, as they sat together on the couch after the kids went to bed, Mark turned to Linda with a thoughtful expression. "So, what are you going to do about this?" Linda sighed, leaning back against the cushions. "Honestly, I don't know yet. Part of me wants to let it go. Carol probably doesn't even realize how ridiculous she sounds. But then again," she trailed off, her jaw tightening slightly, "she called the cops on us, Mark. On us, over a locked barn." "That's not okay." Mark nodded slowly. "Yeah, I get it. It's not just annoying, it's kind of invasive. Plus, imagine if someone else had answered that call instead of officers who already knew you. Things could have gotten awkward fast." "Exactly," Linda said firmly. "And honestly, I'm more upset about the waste of police time than anything else. Those officers were probably needed somewhere else, somewhere important. Instead, they were stuck investigating Christmas lights and rusty tools because of some paranoid HOA busybody." Mark cracked a smile despite himself. "I mean, can you blame them for looking confused? A locked barn full of holiday decorations isn't exactly the stuff of Breaking Bad spin-offs." Linda chuckled softly, but her expression quickly turned serious again. "It's not funny, though not really. People like Carol think they're doing good by sticking their noses into everyone's business, but all they're doing is causing unnecessary drama. And when you throw around accusations like that without proof, it can have real consequences." They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in thought. Finally, Mark spoke up. "You should talk to her. Confront her directly. You know, make sure she understands why this was such a big deal." Linda raised an eyebrow. "You think I should invite her over for coffee and casually drop the 'by the way, I'm the police chief' bomb?" Mark grinned. "Why not? Worst case scenario, she gets embarrassed and leaves us alone. Best case, she learns a lesson about jumping to conclusions." Linda mulled it over. The idea of confronting Carol didn't sit entirely well with her. She wasn't one to seek confrontation for sport, but maybe Mark was right. Maybe this was an opportunity to set boundaries and clear the air. After all, ignoring the issue wouldn't make it go away. If anything, Carol might escalate things further. If she felt vindicated or ignored. The next morning, Linda decided to act. She sent Carol a polite message inviting her over for coffee later that afternoon. Carol, still riding high on the belief that she'd uncovered some deep conspiracy, eagerly accepted. She arrived promptly at 2 o'clock, clipboard tucked under, her arm and a smug smile plastered across her face. When Linda opened the door, Carol launched straight into her spiel. "Thank goodness you finally agreed to meet. I knew something wasn't right about that barn. Did the police confirm my suspicions?" Linda bit back a laugh at the absurdity of the question. Instead of answering immediately, she gestured toward the kitchen table where 2 steaming mugs of coffee waited. "Come on in, we'll talk." Carol followed her inside, clearly expecting some sort of confession or explanation. As they settled into their chairs, Linda poured creamer into her mug and took a measured sip before speaking. First off, she began calmly, "Let me thank you for bringing this to the attention of the authorities. Transparency is important, and I appreciate your concern for our community." Carol preened at the compliment, nodding vigorously. "Of course. That's what I'm here for, to keep Maplewood safe and orderly." Linda gave her a tight-lipped smile. "Right. Well, since we're on the subject of transparency." She paused for dramatic effect, letting the tension build. "There's something you should know about me." Carol leaned forward, intrigued. "Oh? What's that?" Linda met her gaze steadily. "My name is Linda Thompson. I'm the police chief of Metro PD." For a split second, Carol froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. Then, as the weight of Linda's words sank in, her face flushed bright red. She choked on her sip of coffee, coughing violently as she tried to process what she just heard. "You're—" "What?" she stammered, setting her mug down with a clatter. "The police chief," Linda repeated, her tone calm but firm. "Which means the officers who showed up at my house yesterday work for me. Directly." Carol's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She looked utterly mortified, her earlier confidence crumbling into dust. I didn't know." "No, you didn't," Linda said evenly. "And that's fine, you couldn't have known, but now you do. So let's talk about what happened." Carol shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding eye contact. "Look, I was only trying to help." "I understand that," Linda interrupted. "But here's the thing. Accusing someone of illegal activity without evidence isn't helping anyone. It's reckless. It wastes resources, creates unnecessary stress, and can lead to serious consequences for everyone involved." Carol squirmed under Linda's steady gaze. I guess I may have overreacted." "You think?" Linda said dryly. "Calling the police on your neighbors because their barn is locked? Come on. Even if you genuinely believed something was wrong, there are better ways to handle it. Knocking on our door and asking questions, for example. Or bringing your concerns to the HOA board instead of escalating them to law enforcement." Carol nodded frantically, eager to agree with anything. "At this point, you're absolutely right. I see that now. I'm so sorry." Linda held up a hand to stop her. "Apology accepted. But let me be clear, this can't happen again. If I hear of any more unfounded accusations, or worse, harassment, I won't hesitate to take action. And trust me, that's not something either of us wants." Carol swallowed hard, looking genuinely contrite. Understood. Completely understood. With that, the conversation ended. Carol left shortly afterward, practically sprinting to her car as if afraid Linda might change her mind and arrest her on the spot. Meanwhile, Linda watched her go with a mixture of satisfaction and mild pity. She hadn't intended to humiliate Carol, but sometimes a little tough love was necessary to drive a point home. As the days passed, it became clear that Carol had learned her lesson, at least temporarily. She stopped prowling around the Thompsons' property and avoided eye contact whenever they crossed paths. Rumors about the incident spread quickly through the neighborhood, and Carol's reputation took a hit. Some neighbors teased her lightly about her barn gate blunder, while others simply shook their heads at her overzealous behavior. For the Thompsons, life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be in a place like Maplewood Estates. The kids went back to playing outside. Mark resumed tinkering with his car, and Linda continued baking cookies for block parties. But every now and then, when someone brought up the infamous barn story, Linda couldn't resist sharing a knowing smile with Mark. In the end, the whole ordeal served as a reminder that small-town living came with its own unique quirks, and that sometimes the best way to deal with conflict was to face it head-on. For Linda, it also reinforced the importance of balance, staying grounded in her role as a mom and neighbor while embracing the authority she carried as the police chief when necessary. Life in Maplewood Estates would never be boring, and truthfully, the Thompsons wouldn't have wanted it any other way. The fallout from Carol's ill-fated investigation into the Thompsons' barn spread through Maplewood Estates like wildfire. Word traveled fast in a gated community where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. By the time Monday morning rolled around, most of the neighborhood had heard some version of the story. Did you hear? That woman who called the cops on the Thompsons didn't realize their wife is the police chief. At first, it was all anyone could talk about. Neighbors whispered over coffee cups during HOA meetings, kids giggled about it on the playground, and even the mailman couldn't resist cracking a joke when delivering packages. Some people found it hilarious. Others thought it served Carol right, and a few felt bad for her, though not many. After all, she'd brought this on herself by jumping to conclusions without any real evidence. For Carol, those days were absolute misery. Once the self-appointed queen of the HOA, she now avoided eye contact with practically everyone. Her clipboard went unused, her daily patrols ceased entirely, and she started parking her car far away from the Thompsons' house just to avoid running into them. If she did happen to cross paths with Linda or Mark, she'd mumble something vague and hurry off as quickly as possible. The confident, bossy demeanor she once wore like armor had crumbled under the weight of embarrassment. Meanwhile, the Thompsons became minor celebrities within the neighborhood. People who barely spoke to them before suddenly wanted to be there. Best friends. One neighbor dropped off homemade cookies with a note that read, "Thanks for keeping us entertained." Another invited them to a backyard barbecue saying, "We have to hear the full story." Even the local kids started calling their barn the secret headquarters, imagining it filled with gadgets and top-secret files instead of dusty boxes and old tools. Mark loved every second of it. He wasn't one to hold grudges, and he saw the humor in the situation more than anything else. Whenever someone asked him about what happened, he'd launch into an exaggerated retelling of the events, complete with dramatic pauses and sound effects. "And then the police showed up," he'd say, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "and guess what they found inside the barn? A rake. Just a single rake." Linda, on the other hand, handled the attention with her usual grace and wit. She appreciated the goodwill but made sure to keep things lighthearted. When neighbors joked about her secretly moonlighting as a superhero, she'd laugh along and quip, "If only I had time for that. Between work and raising 2 kids, my cape's been collecting dust." Still, beneath the surface, Linda felt a mix of emotions about the whole ordeal. On one hand, she was relieved that Carol seemed to have backed off and hopefully learned a lesson about making baseless accusations. On the other hand, she worried about how the situation might affect the community dynamic long term. Would tensions rise between residents? Would Carol redolently try to regain control of the HOA? Or worse, would others follow her example and start policing each other's lives even more aggressively? To address these concerns, Linda decided to take a proactive approach. She reached out to the HOA board, yes, the actual elected members, not just Carol, and suggested hosting a casual get-together for the neighborhood. Not a formal meeting, but something more relaxed, like a potluck dinner or a picnic in the park. The goal was simple: bring people together, foster open communication, and remind everyone that they were all part of the same community. The idea was met with enthusiasm. Tensions had been simmering beneath the surface for a while, and many residents welcomed the chance to reconnect in a positive way. So on a sunny Saturday afternoon, dozens of families gathered at the small park near the entrance of Maplewood Estates. There were blankets spread across the grass, coolers stocked with lemonade and soda, and tables groaning under the weight of casseroles, fruit salads, and freshly baked pies. Linda and Mark brought their famous pulled pork sandwiches, a recipe Mark had perfected over years of trial and error, and set up shop near the grill. As they mingled with neighbors, Linda made a point of chatting with everyone, including Carol. It wasn't about rubbing salt in the wound. Rather, it was about extending an olive branch and showing that there were no hard feelings. After all, holding on to resentment wouldn't do anyone any good. Carol, for her part, looked visibly uncomfortable throughout the event. She hovered on the edges of conversations, clutching a paper plate like it was a lifeline. But when Linda approached her with a warm smile and said, "Thanks for coming today," Carol managed a tentative nod and murmured, "Thank you for inviting me." It wasn't much, but it was progress. As the day wore on, the atmosphere grew lighter and more relaxed. Kids chased each other around with water balloons, dogs splashed in the shallow stream nearby, and laughter echoed through the air. At one point, someone pulled out a guitar and started playing campfire songs, prompting an impromptu sing-along. Even Carol joined in hesitantly, though she stayed seated and kept her distance from the crowd. By the end of the afternoon, it was clear that the gathering had done its job. People left feeling closer, more connected, and maybe a little less inclined to judge each other based on locked barns or mismatched curtains. For the first time in a long while, Maplewood Estates felt like the kind of place where neighbors genuinely cared about one another, not just the rules they followed. Of course, life isn't perfect, and neither are neighborhoods. Conflicts still arose from time to time, whether over loud music late at night or disagreements about landscaping standards. But thanks to Linda's efforts, the tone of those conversations shifted. Instead of accusatory emails or passive-aggressive notes, people began approaching issues with patience and understanding. They remembered that they weren't just enforcing rules. They were building relationships. As for Carol, her transformation was subtle but noticeable. She still attended HOA meetings and occasionally voiced concerns about property standards, but her fire and brimstone attitude softened considerably. Gone were the clipboard ambushes and unsolicited inspections. In their place was a quieter, more reserved version of Carol, one who listened as much as she spoke and thought twice before escalating minor issues. Some neighbors teased her gently about her past antics, but most treated her with kindness, recognizing that everyone makes mistakes. Over time, Carol even started volunteering for community events, helping organize bake sales and holiday decorations. It wasn't exactly redemption, but it was a step in the right direction. For the Thompsons, life settled back into its comfortable rhythm. The barn remained locked because, hey, why fix what isn't broken? And the kids continued riding their bikes down the cul-de-sac. Mark spent weekends tinkering with his car, while Linda balanced her dual roles as a suburban mom and a police chief with ease. Every now and then, someone would bring up the infamous barn story, usually accompanied by laughter and a shake of the head. And whenever that happened, Linda would simply smile and say, "Well, at least it gave us something interesting to talk about." In the end, the whole saga served as a reminder of a few important truths. that assumptions can lead to unnecessary drama, that communication is key to resolving conflicts, and that sometimes the best way to handle absurd situations is with humor and grace. Life in Maplewood Estates wasn't always smooth sailing, but it was never boring. And truthfully, the Thompsons wouldn't have wanted it any other way. The weeks turned into months, and life in Maplewood Estates settled into a new kind of rhythm. The barn incident slowly faded from the forefront of everyone's minds. Though it remained a favorite topic at dinner parties or casual get-togethers, it became one of those stories that neighbors loved to retell, often with embellishments added for dramatic effect. "Did you hear what happened when Carol called the cops on Linda?" someone would ask, leaning in conspiratorially. By now, the story had grown legs of its own. Some versions claimed there were flashing lights and helicopters involved, while others insisted the barn was secretly housing a rare collection of vintage cars. But for the Thompsons, the aftermath wasn't just about laughs over coffee or playful teasing during block parties. The whole experience left them with lessons they wouldn't soon forget. For Mark, it reinforced his belief in taking things lightly and not letting small annoyances ruin your day. He'd always been easygoing, but this episode reminded him how important it was to find humor even in frustrating situations. After all, if you couldn't laugh at a locked barn causing such a fuss, what could you laugh at? Linda, on the other hand, came away with a deeper appreciation for balance, both in her personal life and in her role as a leader. Being the police chief meant she dealt with serious issues daily, from violent crimes to complex investigations. Yet here in Maplewood, she realized that leadership wasn't just about authority. It was also about connection. By stepping forward and addressing the situation head-on, not with anger, but with understanding, she showed her neighbors that she was approachable and human too. That lesson stayed with her long after the dust had settled. As for Carol, well, she underwent a transformation no one could have predicted. At first, she retreated into herself, avoiding social gatherings and keeping her opinions to a minimum. But over time, something shifted. Maybe it was the kindness extended to her by Linda during their awkward coffee chat. Or maybe it was the gentle ribbing from neighbors that helped her see the absurdity of her actions. Whatever the reason, Carol began to soften around the edges. Still cared about rules, after all. Some structure is necessary for any community, but her methods changed. Instead of storming up to people's doors demanding answers, she started asking questions politely. Instead of jotting down complaints on her clipboard, she took notes on ideas for improving the neighborhood. She even joined the committee organizing the annual Fall Festival, surprising everyone by suggesting a pumpkin carving contest that ended up being a huge hit. Some neighbors joked that Carol had gone through a personality transplant, but most agreed that her evolution felt genuine. Sure, she still had moments where her old habits crept back, a stern reminder about parking regulations here, a pointed comment about lawn maintenance there, but overall, she seemed more grounded. And deep down, she knew she owed much of that change to Linda's quiet yet firm intervention. The ripple effects of the barn saga reached beyond just the Thompsons and Carol, though. It sparked conversations throughout the community about how they treated each other and handled disagreements. People started thinking twice before jumping to conclusions or escalating minor issues. They remembered that living in a gated neighborhood didn't mean perfection. It meant working together despite imperfections. One evening, during a casual gathering at the park, Linda found herself chatting with a group of neighbors about trust and communication. Someone brought up the barn story again, laughing about how ridiculous it sounded in hindsight. Linda smiled, nodding along, but then she leaned forward slightly, her tone turning thoughtful. "You know," she said, "this whole thing taught me something important. We're all human, right? We make mistakes, we misinterpret things, and Sometimes we let our fears get the better of us. What matters is how we respond afterward. Do we double down and create division, or do we step back, listen, and try to understand? Her words hung in the air for a moment, met with nods and murmurs of agreement. One neighbor chimed in, saying, "That's true. I think we've all learned to give each other a little more grace because of what happened." Another added, "And honestly, it made us closer as a community. Weird as it sounds, that silly barn drama brought us together." Linda grinned. "Well, if my locked barn can unite an entire neighborhood, maybe I should keep it padlocked forever." The group erupted in laughter, and the conversation moved on to lighter topics. But Linda's point stuck with them. From that day forward, there was a noticeable shift in how residents interacted with one another. Disagreements still arose because, let's face it, no community is without conflict, but they were resolved with patience and respect rather than accusations and hostility. For the Thompsons, life continued much as it always had. The kids grew taller. Mark kept tinkering with his car, though he swore he'd finally fixed the engine for good, and Linda balanced her dual roles with ease. Every once in a while, someone new to the neighborhood would hear whispers of the infamous barn story and ask for details. When that happened, Linda would simply smile and say, "It's a long story, but the short version is, never underestimate the power of a locked door." The barn itself remained exactly as it had been, weathered and unassuming, its doors firmly shut. Occasionally, Mark suggested turning it into something fancier, a game room, perhaps, or a mini movie theater, but Linda shook her head every time. "Why mess with perfection?" she'd tease. "Besides, it's become part of our legend now." And so, the barn stood as a symbol of sorts, not just of the Thompsons' quirky sense of humor, but of the resilience and spirit of Maplewood Estates. It reminded everyone that even in the most ordinary places, extraordinary things could happen. Sometimes, those things were funny. Other times, they were challenging. But always, they shaped the fabric of the community in ways no one expected. In the end, the barn saga wasn't just about a nosy neighbor or a misunderstood misunderstanding. It was about growth for individuals, for relationships, and for the neighborhood as a whole. It proved that even in a world filled with rules and regulations, humanity shines brightest when we choose kindness over judgment, laughter over tension. And connection over conflict. Life in Maplewood Estates wasn't perfect, and it probably never would be. But thanks to a locked barn and the chaos that followed, it was stronger, warmer, and infinitely more interesting. And truthfully, the Thompsons and their neighbors wouldn't have wanted it any other way.